Have you ever watched a successful leader make a sudden shift in their career or their life? Someone who seemed completely settled, comfortable, established. Someone at the top of their game, and then suddenly they start moving in an entirely different direction. A shift no one in their professional world saw coming. From the outside, it looks like a complete 180. The kind of move that makes other leaders stop, lean in, and ask, what in the world happened? Maybe they stepped away from an executive role. Maybe they left a company everyone thought that they would retire from. Maybe they walked away from visibility, status, momentum, or a version of success that looked completely secure from the outside, and instead of climbing higher, they moved towards something slower, more aligned. And the people around them immediately started reaching for explanations. Maybe it was burnout, midlife crisis, something must have happened, or they probably just got tired. Because from our vantage point, these moves look totally irrational. A complete disruption of the professional identity they spent decades building. But here's what I keep noticing about moments like this. We don't just observe those stories from a distance. We feel something when we hear them. Curiosity, confusion, admiration, and sometimes even discomfort. And if I were being really honest right now, sometimes something that feels a little like envy. And not because we necessarily want their exact life, but because watching someone move towards something that feels internally aligned forces us to quietly examine our own. And the more conversations I have with leaders sitting inside this tension, the tension between the successful life they've built and the deeper significance they feel called toward, the more I think we may be misunderstanding these moments entirely. Because when we look at someone's leadership journey from the outside, we usually only see the disruption, the title they walked away from, the unexpected role change, the sudden shift in direction, and because we can't easily explain it, we assume something went wrong. But maybe the move everyone called irrational wasn't really a crisis at all. Maybe it wasn't an escape either. Maybe what looked like a 180 from the outside was actually a straight line from the inside. In the world of whiskey making, we talk a lot about distillation as a process of removal, taking out what doesn't belong. But there's another side to distillation that we don't talk about nearly as much. And that's what we're going to be exploring today. Welcome to Crafted Clarity. I'm Steve Muscato. As you heard in the opening, we're talking today about the kind of moves that confuse people, the pivots that disrupt the script, the decisions that seem to undo a perfectly coherent trajectory. But the question I'm actually interested in today isn't why those people made the move. It's why watching them makes us feel something. Most of us have seen this happen. Someone we respected, someone at the top of their game, makes a shift that doesn't compute. And the reaction around it is rarely neutral. People get uncomfortable, or fascinated, or weirdly inspired. Sometimes all three at once. And I think part of the reason is this. Somewhere underneath our reaction is a version of the same question they were sitting with. A question many of us have learned to set aside. Because the timing isn't right, or the risk feels too high, or because the life we built has too much invested in the current direction to examine it too closely. We talk a lot here about success and significance, and about the tension between what we built and what we're built for. And most of the time, We talk about distillation as removal. But today I want to talk about the other side. Because distillation doesn't just remove, it also reveals. For people who don't spend a lot of time around whiskey, distillation is fundamentally a refining process. A raw fermented liquid gets heated, and different compounds separate at different temperatures. And over time, what emerges becomes more concentrated, more distinct, more itself. And most of the time, when people use the word distillation in business or leadership, they focus entirely on what gets left behind. The impurities, the excess, the things that don't belong. And that framing matters, but there's another truth happening inside the process. Distillation also reveals things that were already present from the beginning. Hidden notes, depth, complexity. Those characteristics don't come from adding something new to the spirit. They're revealed because the right conditions finally allowed what was already there to surface. And honestly, I think this changes how we interpret people. Because when someone makes a professional move that confuses everyone around them, most people only see the immediate decision, the resignation, the sudden pivot, the unexpected change. What they don't see is what was forming underneath for years. The maturity, the parts of a person that slowly went underground because their daily roles simply had no use for them anymore. Stillness, reflection, deep curiosity, a different definition of success. The desire to build something that feels more human. Those things don't disappear. They wait. And meanwhile, competence gets rewarded. Momentum keeps getting rewarded. Performance keeps getting rewarded. And eventually, someone can become incredibly successful at carrying a role, while quietly feeling more disconnected from parts of themselves that used to feel alive. Not fake, not wasted, formative, but maybe no longer fully integrated. And I want to be really clear about something before we go further. I'm not making an argument for quitting your job. It's not anti-success, and it's not anti-corporate. Honestly, the role you're in right now may be exactly where the formation is supposed to be happening. But it's worth asking whether we've only learned to think about distillation as removal and missed the other side completely. If you spend enough time around people who love whiskey, eventually someone's going to hand you a high-proof pour and tell you to do something that sounds completely backwards. They're going to say, add a drop of water. And at first, it's not going to make sense because water dilutes things. It weakens them. At least that's what we assume. Why would you add water to something that is so carefully crafted? But something interesting happens when you do. The aroma opens up. Notes that were hard to detect suddenly become more noticeable. The whiskey doesn't become less itself. In many ways, it becomes more recognizable for what it was already. The spirit didn't change. The conditions did. And honestly, I've watched organizations go through this too. A company walks away from a product line everyone assumed they would keep forever. An organization shifts towards something less profitable but more aligned. A leader redirects resources towards work that feels more foundational to who they really are. And from the outside, people get confused. Why would they move away from the thing that made them successful? But sometimes those moments aren't departures from identity. Sometimes they're movements toward it. The conditions changed enough for something deeper to finally surface. And I think certain seasons in our own lives work the same way. Sometimes that single drop of water isn't something dramatic. It could be a slower season, a change in responsibilities, or a difficult conversation. Or maybe it's finally reaching a level of success you worked towards for years, only to realize it doesn't feel the way you expected it would. And in that space, something surfaces that has been there for a very long time. Not newly created, just easier to recognize. Those moments don't invent something new in us. They simply create enough space for what was already there to finally become visible. I've watched this happen to people I deeply respect, and it completely changed the way I interpret these major life transitions. During my corporate days, I worked alongside a leader named Paul Rand. Paul had built exactly the kind of career people point to when they define visible institutional success. Vice President of Communications at the University of Chicago, global agency leadership, major board involvement, executive level influence. His career path looked perfectly clear. The kind of career where everyone assumes the next step is simply a bigger institution, a higher title, or more visibility. That was the script. But recently, Paul stepped out of that lane to build something entirely different called Nomadic Spirit. It's a thoughtful publication and community centered around international travel, exploring the deeper why behind the where. It's slower, more reflective, built around curiosity, meaning, and how we actually move through the world. And I remember when I first saw it, it looked like a major departure, a detour from the expected path. But the more I sat with it, the more it actually made perfect sense. Because when I thought about the Paul I actually knew, the curiosity, the thoughtfulness, the depth underneath the professional polish, I realized those notes had always been there. The previous environment simply didn't create much room for them to fully surface. That move didn't change who he was. It didn't reinvent him. It changed the conditions, though, for something foundational to become more visible. And I think that's true more often than we realize. The outside world sees the title change, the new direction, the visible pivot, but they don't see the years underneath it, the formation, the pressure, the extraction, the slow distillation process that had been happening long before the change became visible to anyone else. This is the exact friction point where the tension between what we built and what we're built for begins to rise to the surface. It isn't necessarily that we're stuck in the wrong life. It's that the inner questioning slowly starts outgrowing the outer container. Over time, the parts of us that are most visible, the most rewarded by the world, naturally become louder. And meanwhile, the parts of us that feel most alive often get pushed further into the background. And it's usually because the current environment has no immediate use for them. And when those parts stay quiet long enough, it becomes easy to assume they're gone. We tell ourselves, well, I guess this is just who I am now. Or this role is my footprint. That other part of me was probably just a phase. But what is true to us has a way of remaining remarkably consistent across decades, across different companies, different seasons, different roles. The same themes keep returning, waiting for the conditions to change enough to become noticeable again. And when they finally do, it can feel surprisingly intense because something familiar is finally being acknowledged after years underground. And maybe that's why these shifts look so dramatic from the outside. Because what everyone else experienced as a sudden change was actually a long process of invisible formation, finally becoming visible. If you've ever gone to a whiskey tasting, you know they gave you a small card to write down what you noticed, the distinct characteristics, the hidden notes, the things you want to remember long enough after the glass is empty. Here are my tasting notes from today. You can also find these reflections as a digital download or inside the Still app at craftedclarity.net. What keeps surfacing in you, no matter how many seasons, roles, or responsibilities get built around it? What's the note that consistently returns? Not what you think you should be surfacing, but what actually keeps coming back. Think about someone you watched make a move that didn't make sense on paper. What do you think was forming in them during their quiet seasons that the outside world couldn't see? And what does your reaction to the move tell you about your own? What parts of yourself became quieter over the years because your role or environment had no use for them? They're not gone. They're just underground, waiting for the conditions to change. What would it look like to introduce your own drop of water? Not a crisis, not an emotional exit, just a slight shift in conditions that allows what's already present in you to become a little more detectable. The next time you see someone make a major professional shift that seems to break the script, or the next time you feel the heat of that internal questioning rise up in your own life, remember this. The process isn't sudden at all. The outside world simply wasn't in the room for years of pressure, extraction, and the distillation underneath it. They weren't becoming someone else. They were becoming more recognizable to themselves. So I'll leave you with the question I find myself asking more and more. What's been forming in you, underneath the role, underneath the professional momentum, underneath the identity you've spent your life building, that your current conditions haven't allowed you to fully reveal yet? You don't have to answer it today. You don't have to blow up your life. You don't have to change your business model tomorrow. Just notice if the question feels familiar. Because if it does, it probably isn't new. It doesn't take breaking the glass. Sometimes it's just a drop of water. That's the other side of distillation. And always remember, clarity isn't found. It's crafted. Thanks for listening to Crafted Clarity. If you're a leader wrestling with the tension between success and significance, or if you're trying to align your work with a deeper calling, I'd love to connect with you. If your organization is facing questions about strategy, whether it's alignment, ROI, or building confidence in your team, this is the work we do every day at iBrand. And if you walk this journey yourself, or maybe you're right in the middle of it, I'd love to hear your story and maybe even share it here on the podcast. You can find me at craftedclarity.net.